It's not on. Ladies and gentlemen, it sounds. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not working, Toby. Ladies and gentlemen, good. Bit of hush. Can you all hear me at the back? Right. Okay, you can't hear. Anyway, I'll shout. Okay, well, as you can see from the title, we are dealing with three great figures of Prague, Jan Hus, the Emperor Rudolf II, and St. John Nepomuk. And we'll begin, of course, with Hus. Jan Hus, as we shall see in a moment, great reformer, and there is this magnificent statue of him in the Old Town Square, and you can see an aerial view on the top left. And the statue is by the same man we saw yesterday, Ladislav Saloon, who produced the statue of the Rabbi Loff. Again, this huge figure is sort of rising up triumphantly before you on this great plinth. And it's got the writing that one of his phrases or sayings, love each other and wish the truth to everyone. And he is today still an enormously important figure in Czech history, and you can see his background from the, there's a detail of the slide, of course. He was born in a town called Hussites, so obviously that's why his name became Hus. He was obviously highly intelligent, although he came from a poor background without much opportunity, and he graduated from the Charles University, which was started yesterday. We saw yesterday Charles IV started the university, and he's a lecturer in theology and becomes one of the greatest thinkers, religious thinkers of the time, of his day. He's appointed the rector of Charles University. And he's very influenced by the writings of Wycliffe, the Scottish reformer, and he is very much one of the leaders of the attempt to stop the corruption in the Catholic Church. In doing so, he became excommunicated. He continues to preach, and then he tragically makes the decision to attend one of the great ecclesiastical conferences of the Catholic Church, which was in Constance. Constance, which of course is between Switzerland and Germany. And despite the fact that he had been given a safe conduct to go to the conference, he was arrested and is burnt at the stake. And it's one of the most sort of tragic events. If someone could switch their phone off, it would be helpful. So this is the chapel which he preaches at, the Bethlehem Chapel, and it was founded not necessarily by the Hussites themselves, but he uses it as his venue for the preaching of his beliefs, which are very much criticizing the Catholic Church. It became a Protestant place of worship following it was outlawed rather as a Protestant place of worship after the Battle of the White Mountain, which we shall see later. It was handed over to the Jesuits. Obviously, it could be the antipathy of the Hussites. And it then is sort of abandoned and becomes an apartment house. And most fascinatingly, it was really a derelict ruin by the time the Second World War ended. Not that it had anything to do with the Second World War, but it was not a functional building by the end of the Second World War. And when the communists come to power, they actually reconstruct it as a place of worship, which is most extraordinary. The reason being that they thought the Hussites, who were very on the one side of the church, were a better bet than the Catholics, who were completely on the other side. And they therefore promoted the Hussite preachings in opposition to the Catholics. Both religions were in being during the communist era, and we'll see the Archbishop's Palace, the Catholic Archbishop's Palace tomorrow. And there, one of the pieces of propaganda from the Hussites, there is Satan, the illustration on the bottom right, Satan dressed as a priest. And there are in existence quite a number, because it's a huge industry, really, the Hussite followers who are still quite strong in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech lands. And there, an illustration on the left of Hus preaching, supposedly in the Bethlehem chapel, and we don't know what he looked like, of course. But there he's being burnt at the stake. He's wearing a sort of dunce's cap, and there he is being burnt with the priesthood on the left-hand side. So it was a terrible, tragic event, which, in fact, did nothing to stop the Hussites continuing as the Protestant revolution, and it swept across the Czech lands. And, in fact, there was civil war broke out at this time, following Hus's being burnt at the stake in 1415. And the rebel forces are led by this extraordinary man called Žižka. Žižka was partially blind, and that's why in the illustration you can see in the middle, he's wearing a sort of bandage across his face, which is sort of shorthand for the fact that he can't see. He was an incredibly dynamic leader, and you can see him there leading the peasant army against the forces of sort of the establishment, as it were. And in fact, the Hussites became incredibly successful in their victories. And their banner had on it the chalice. We'll see the reason for that in a moment. And there are the sort of staves and sticks and so on that the peasants took as their implements of war in their battles against the Catholics. There is today in Prague a statue, you can see the statue on the left, of Jan Hus, and he is, of course, the great hero after Hus's death, leading the rebellion, and actually being incredibly successful. And you can see here, they produce these sort of structures which are called wagon forts, these Wagenburgs, which in fact remind us very much of a lager in this country, so nothing is ever new in life. And you can see they sort of tied their wagons together as a means of defense, and from there they would obviously attack the enemy. The flag itself, you can see at the top, it has a goose on it, and in Czech a goose is a husa, and more importantly there's the chalice. The point was that the Hussites, advocating a reform in the church and advocating the suppression of the corruption in the church, also felt that the church was there for the people and not for only the very grand. And they felt that in communion, generally, in the Catholic communion, the bread is given to the people, but the wine is actually only drunk by the priesthood. Sorry, I've got a really bad frog in my throat this morning. And the chalice, therefore, represents the fact that they believe that both the bread and the wine should be given to all worshippers at a communion. And in consequence, because of that, they became known as the utraquists, because in Latin it breaks down to the fact that in both kinds, it means in both kinds. In fact, in other words, they wanted both to be given to the people, both the wine and the bread. The rebellion was extraordinarily successful, and eventually a peace is confirmed. It was the Peace of Kutná-Hora, where both the Catholics and the utraquists were given equal rights. That was in 1485. When they went into battle, apparently they sung various hymns, and there is this Hussite hymn which is called "Ye Are God's Warriors." And it's very, very long, as you can see, but the first part reads, "Ye who are God's warriors and of his law, pray to God for help and have faith in him, that always with him you will be victorious. Christ is worth all sacrifices. He will pay you back 100-fold. If you give up your life for him, you will receive eternal life. It's pretty sort of stirring stuff. And apparently they sang this as they went into battle. They sang this as they approached, say, a village that was opposing them. And very often, the village, hearing this hymn or this song, would actually capitulate immediately because they knew that they would not succeed. So I'll play you the song. And what is interesting, when you look at it, when you look at this clip, you'll see that all the congregation who are standing around a sort of hilly castle is singing this song. They obviously know every single word, which is quite something. I mean, you would be trying to remember your hymns as you sing them today. You don't remember much. So there we are. We're back to Prague, and the Hussites, as I say, were a very significant force in the period of the 15th, 16th century in Czech history. And although they're no longer a very significant religion, they are very much on the fundamental Protestant side. But at the same time, towards the end of the 15th century, there is one of the most extraordinary buildings in Prague, which is the Vladislav Hall. It's named after King Vladislav, the ruler of the time. And it's by a German architect called Benedict Reed. And you'll see it's an enormous sort of engineering feat. It's the vast, vast span of this room, which is still, by the way, used very much as a public hall of ceremonies and so on. And I've often seen the room filled with chairs, waiting or having just recently been used for some graduation ceremony or some declaration by the president or whatever. The point about it is it's not only technically very advanced for the period, for late 1400s, 1490, it also has this extraordinary Gothic vaulting. It's very, very elaborate and very decorative. And it's not the same as, but it's the same feeling as the vaulting in King's College Chapel, Cambridge, which has the same elaboration, this elaborate fan vaulting, which you get in English architecture at the very end of the Gothic. The Gothic is coming to the end, and it's sort of ending with a bang. It's ending with an explosion of decoration. And this is the same here. Or in addition, though, the windows, you see the big, big windows on both sides, which are the original format of the windows. On the outside of them, they have classical columns. So you've got this wonderful fusion of the emerging Renaissance and the disappearing Gothic ornament in one building. Now, it's named after the king of the time, and the king of the time is King Vladislav. King Vladislav II Jageo. Vladislav is the king of Bohemia and Hungary at the time. You can see his dates below. Now, he was obviously a man with some vision, and he engineers a double marriage. He engineers the marriage of his son to a Habsburg girl, and he engineers the marriage of his daughter to a Habsburg boy. And so he aligns himself with the Habsburgs. So the two portraits on the far sides, on the left and the right-hand sides, are Louis of Jagiellon and Anne of Hungary. They are brother and sister. They marry, in turn, Habsburg children. You can see that Louis marries Mary of Austria, and when she becomes a widow shortly thereafter, the marriage doesn't last very long because Louis is killed in battle. She becomes a very, very significant member of the Habsburg family. The women of the Habsburgs are usually better than the men. And then her nephew is Ferdinand. She was a different generation, but they marry. So Ferdinand, who becomes a Holy Roman Emperor, marries Anne of Hungary. So she was always, and then Louis Jagiellon marries Mary of Austria. Mary of Austria would have become the Queen of Bohemia and Hungary if her husband had lived. Her husband dies in battle, so his titles is inherited by his sister on the right-hand side. So she cannot become the Queen of Hungary and the Queen of Bohemia because she's a woman. So her husband sort of says, all right, dear, I'll take them over. And he becomes the King of Bohemia and the King of Hungary. So he not only is the Holy Roman Emperor, he now has two crowns to wear as well, two kingdoms to administer. And so this is the point when Ferdinand I, and the Habsburgs in general, as I say at the top there, the Habsburgs take power, and they take power in 1526, the year that Louis is killed in battle. So from that point onwards, the Habsburgs rule Bohemia, they rule the Czechs from 1526 to 1918. And you can understand why, therefore, the Czechs and many other nationalities as well, but we're talking about the Czechs and Prague, but you can understand why, therefore, for those centuries after centuries, the Czechs could not express their own desires, their own languages, their own music, their own culture, because everything was channeled through Vienna, through German-speaking Vienna. And the resentment built up until the nationalist movement of the 19th century. So the portraits of the two on the right-hand side, they were not very flattering to either of them, I don't think, but actually it was quite a love match, although it was an arranged marriage. And Ferdinand I fell deeply in love with his wife, who's known in history, as I say, as Anne of Hungary. And he builds for her this summer palace in the castle grounds on the castle district, just adjacent to the St. Vitus Cathedral. And as you can see, I've written a quote there, the first secular Renaissance building north of the Alps. If you look at those arches, the colonnade there, the arches bouncing from column to column, they're almost an identical reflection of what you find in Florence. The same colonnade is in the Hospital of the Innocents 100 years earlier by Brunelleschi. And so it's quite clear that now coming into Prague, way before France or England, the Renaissance is coming into the Czech lands at this very early date of the early 1500s. This is the period, of course, of Henry VIII in England, where there is the early Renaissance, but it isn't nearly as sophisticated as it is in Prague. So the colonnade is very authentic. The roof, with this rather strange sort of upturned ship-like roof, is slightly later by a German, who I've mentioned there, Boniface Volmut, but the original structure by an Italian, Paolo della Stella. And so this is a very significant building. There are not that many buildings of the Renaissance in Prague, but this is obviously a very great landmark at this time when the Habsburgs first assume power. In the cathedral, in St. Vitus Cathedral, not visible in detail now, you can't go and visit it except viewing it from the side aisles. You can see in the little left-hand side, you can see there the tomb of the first Habsburgs in the cathedral. You can't, as I say now, look at it in detail. You can only stand on the sides. In the middle, as you can see there, it's a magnificent piece of carving. It's by a Flemish sculptor whose name is Collin. And it, again, reminding us, of course, the Habsburgs now not only rule from Vienna, they are now kings of Hungary and Bohemia. They also, of course, own the Netherlands, you know, like you own a sort of plot of land in Betty's Bay or something. And so from the Netherlands came this chap, Alexander Collin. And it's a very, very beautiful work of art. There in the middle lies Ferdinand, who became the first Habsburg to wear the crown of Bohemia. There's his wife Anne. She's got rather portly, I think, in that on the right-hand side. And there's their son Maximilian. So Maximilian II will be the second Habsburg to rule. And you can see here a portrait of Maximilian. Habsburgs married cousins all the time. They never married outside the family, and they passed on all the good and all the bad genes continuously, generation after generation. So Maximilian marries his cousin Mary of Spain, and you can see all the long chins they get. And there are their children. The girl is the eldest, Anna. Well, she doesn't get much of a look in because she's a girl. So their second child is Rudolf. And there's Rudolf, the eldest boy, and there's the second boy, Ernst. And Rudolf becomes, therefore, the third emperor, who is also the king of Bohemia. And Rudolf is frightfully important for Prague. The Emperor Rudolf, here seen in a portrait by one of the many artists who he employed in Prague, a man called Joseph Heinz. He was born in Vienna but brought up in Spain, and he was a very strange man. Whether the fact that he was brought up in Spain has anything to do with it, I'm not sure. But he was separated from his family apart from anything else, which couldn't have helped him very much. But he's a very strange man. He's a recluse. He had no interest in politics. The Habsburgs had two aspects. They were always very, very clever, the Habsburgs, and most of them were very artistic. And he gets the artistic genes. He doesn't get the political genes. And he probably is, arguably, the greatest artistic patron in the Western world, in Western history. He's certainly in modern history. He certainly was an incredibly great patron. But he did this to the exclusion of exercising any political role in his great empire. And that is why he is vilified by certain people, but not all. Anyway, he succeeds his father as King of Bohemia, and he moves his court from Vienna to Prague. We don't really know why he did that, because he was, as I say, a very introspective man. He obviously didn't chatter away about what his thoughts were. And it is felt that he went at one year early on when he was still the crown prince. And he visited Prague. The Habsburgs were never very popular with the people. And funnily enough, they rather welcomed Rudolf. They thought, perhaps they felt that he had a sort of empathy with them. Anyway, whatever, he had a very tumultuous welcome when he got to Prague the first time as a crown prince. So that probably, he felt more at ease. And anyway, he moves his court to Prague. So in those buildings we've seen surrounding the cathedral, part of the castle district, all those buildings, which, of course, what you see now is later, but there would have been buildings there then. And they were his to live in. And he lived there, very often not showing himself for months, if not years on end. He just lived in seclusion, acquiring more and more and more and more superb works of art. If you're the emperor and you say to a sculptor or a jeweler or a painter, come and work for me, the painter or the jeweler doesn't actually argue. I mean, this is a command. You can't actually say no. And so he brought to Prague an incredible range of artists and craftsmen of all sorts and shapes and sizes. And they were producing paintings for him with superb carved objects, we'll see in a moment, and so on and so forth. Most of the treasures that survive are mainly now in Vienna, we'll see why in a moment. But there are some incredible treasures that he collected. But they would have been literally the tip of an iceberg. There would have been huge amounts that he collected, and only for himself. Nobody ever saw this collection. It was all his and his alone. All the Bruegels, All the famous Bruegels once were in his collection. Many of the famous Dürers were once in his collection. It is quite extraordinary how much he had and how much he acquired. That was his sole sort of direction in life, that he wanted to acquire these wonderful works of art for his own enjoyment. And eventually, because of this, I mean, the empire was sort of falling apart, and he does have to cede control to his brother. He then is stripped of all his powers by 1612, when he dies shortly thereafter. He's seen, as I say, as an ineffectual ruler whose mistakes led to the 30 Years' War. That's some commentators. Others see him as a great and influential patron of the arts, and a devotee of science and learning. He was a very liberal man, as I have already mentioned, in relation to Rabbi Loff. He was an extraordinarily liberal man, and he gave rights to both Protestants, the Hussites, and the Catholics. And he welcomed the rabbi himself into his castle, which is, as I say, quite unheard of. So he's a very, very multifaceted man, and he's now really only now, in the last 20 years, coming into focus, because he is rather strange. There is an engraving by one of these many, many men, German, Hofnagel, who is here illustrating Prague at that time under Rudolf in the late early 1600s. There, of course, is the bell tower, and there is the chancel of St. Vitus. The nave hasn't been built yet. There are the buildings. That's what the buildings would have looked like then, actually prettier than they are now, surrounding the castle, surrounding the cathedral. That's where Rudolf lived. And there you can see a general view. There is the castle district on the right, top right. There's the lesser town where the craftsmen lived. And of course it expanded under Rudolf because there were more and more craftsmen. There is the bridge crossing the river Vltava, and there is the old town. Those are the twin steeples you can see on the left-hand side of what is the tin church, which we saw yesterday, that fairy tale steeples and pinnacles of the tin church. So a lot by now, in the late early 1600s, survives as we see it today. And that again is what is so extraordinary about Prague. Now, this was a portrait created of Rudolf. He absolutely loved it. It was sort of one of his favorite. And it's all created out of fruits and vegetables. Because he was strange. I mean, there's no doubt about that. The Habsburgs had, as I say, amazing artistic genes. Some of them had amazing political genes. And there was also a mad gene in the Habsburgs as well, which came out occasionally. It does vaguely come out with Rudolf, more than vaguely. He was an obsession. He was an obsessive. Anyway, here, by this artist Giuseppe Arcimboldo, is Rudolf shown as the god of the seasons, Vertumnus. And there is the artist who created it, this extraordinary man called Arcimboldo. And the painting today is in Sweden, in Skockloster Castle, and we'll see why in a moment. Now, Arcimboldo worked for Rudolf's father, Maximilian II, the second of the Habsburg rulers of Bohemia. And so Arcimboldo was at court both in Vienna and in Prague. He'll follow Rudolf from Vienna to when he moves his capital in the 1580s to Prague. And here in Vienna still today are Summer and Fire and Winter and Water. All made out, as you say, of fruits, or in the case of fire, out of ammunition and whatever, and then winter's made out of sort of hoary tree trunks, and water made out of fish. They are fascinating, these anthropomorphic paintings, and have acquired enormous sort of popularity again in the last 20 years or so. But again, many of them today are in Sweden. And you can see here, too, from two of the courtiers. There's a jurist. He's a lawyer. And it's thought to be, in fact, somebody who's recognizable at the time, called Sazius. And there is a librarian, the court librarian, thought to be a man called Latius. And you can see made out of books and so on. And both of them seemingly were actually recognizable. And they're fun, but they're also weird. I mean, Rudolf was weird. And one must remember that we're discussing the late 1500s. The late 1500s in art is the period of Mannerism. Mannerism is the style that reacts against the Renaissance, because you're now 2 generations on from the Raphael and all his beautiful paintings. And the artist then is belittled. The artist then doesn't have a feeling, doesn't have an ability to create anything more beautiful than the Renaissance. And so what you do is create things actually less beautiful, rather weird paintings, as you can see here. And it was a style which was universally accepted, and it was very, very popular. So both these paintings now in Sweden, one in the National Museum in Stockholm, one again in Skockloster. And then another artist who is very significant in the patronage of Rudolf is a man called Bartholomeus Spranger. Like many of these artists and craftsmen, they came from the Low Countries, from what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, and he came from Antwerp. He worked in Italy, summoned to Prague, summoned to Vienna, and then travels to Prague with Rudolf in 1581. And it's said that he was obviously very intimate with the emperor. Obviously, the emperor felt at ease with him, and he did with very few people. And his studio became the room where the emperor came to relax, which is rather charming in a way. And he has considerable influence upon northern artists of the period. Now, he paints for Rudolf a vast range of mythological and early sort of Grecian legend paintings, Grecian stories, Greek legends. But basically what he's doing is producing for Rudolf, and for Rudolf alone, you must remember, nobody would have seen these, or in fact, the very, 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 very chosen few would have seen them, but they were painted for Rudolf. And basically, they're pornography. And there's, in fact, there is it was only up until about 1960 that the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, which has now possession of these, the great art gallery in Vienna, they would not display them to anybody. They were hidden away. They felt they were too suggestive to even be displayed to anybody. And basically now you can regard them as soft porn, basically. And this is what Rudolf obviously enjoyed in his seclusion, in his weird mind. He never married. We don't know whether he was gay or not. How can we ever tell now? But he certainly probably was bisexual anyway. And he obviously enjoyed looking at feminine beauty, and very often, which is the one on the right, I think, is not only soft porn, it's actually getting rather hard too. There's Minerva dressed in a very skimpy suit of armor, I feel. She's got her foot on a man's throat. So there's a bit of M&S going on as well. Not SMS, M&S. These are by Spranger. And his influence is considerable, but they're typical of the time. Both Minerva and Venus, well, this is just a cover for painting nude figures, really. And they are these long, elongated poses, these sort of exaggerated, sort of slithery effects of the pose, which is very typical of Mannerism, very, very typical indeed. And Spranger will have an influence upon his contemporaries in Flanders and in the Netherlands. And this is another one here. This is where Hercules is meant to do women's work, and he's spinning, and there is his temptress, Omphal, showing a great deal. There she's got a very, very large club in her hand. So it's... You know, it's all titillation for Rudolf. As I say, there's nothing written. We have no knowledge. You can only assume that this is what he preferred. Well, obviously he enjoyed them because he was intimate with the artists. They were very great friends. So these are all today in Vienna, and we'll see why in a moment. Now, another artist, more sort of conventional artist, and one could give lectures and lectures upon this. I mean, there are books written on it about Rudolf's patronage. This is a man called Adriaen de Vries, who really is today one of the great sculptors renowned of any century. I mean, he's equal to Michelangelo. That's why he's called sometimes the Dutch Michelangelo. And again, summoned to Prague, of course. He produces incredible works of art, all in this very, very beautiful bronze, absolutely wonderful bronzes. And there is a bust, much more conventional bust, and obviously very flattering. I don't think Rudolf ever put on a suit of armor in his life. But there he is as a great commanding general. He is trains under Gian Bologna in Florence. Of course, Gian Bologna, again, was one of the great sculptors of the period. Travels to Rome, but then he has 2 periods working in Prague and remains there till his death. Now, in the sack of Prague, we're getting to why these treasures leave Prague. In the sack of Prague, which took place just at the last few days of the 30 Years' War, in 1648. In the sack of Prague, the Swedes pillaged many treasures, as I say there politely, and including a considerable number of works by Adriaen de Vries. So you need to go to Sweden now to see them all. But today, if a work of Adriaen de Vries comes onto the market, the open market, so in the sale rooms, very seldom, but they do sometimes, they command tens of millions today, tens of millions. He's one of the great sculptors of the world, and little known because either his works are in Sweden or they're sort of been lost in the mist somewhere. But there you can see 2 works which we know were in Rudolf's collection. There's no doubt about it. The Mercury and abducting Psyche, again, very erotic posing there, very erotic posing. Mercury abducting Psyche on the left, it's in the Louvre, and then Venus borne aloft by Putti, which is again in Stockholm. But both were in possession or in Rudolf's inventory at the time. And if you go to Sweden, as I'm sure many of you have on cruises or whatever, and you go to the Palace of Drottningholm, which is today the palace of the present King of Sweden, in the gardens, which I don't think generally you can wander in, but perhaps if you become intimate with the king you can. But here you can see a statue of Hercules. Hercules here, who's doing some great deed of valor, not spinning. And you can see that his club held aloft in each of the 4 illustrations. It is Hercules, and the top two pictures are taken of Drottningholm in Sweden, and that is the original statue. This was a statue taken from Prague, from the Wallenstein Palace, taken at the end of the 30 Years' War to Sweden, where it still remains. I mean, this is Elgin marbles writ large, but I mean, you know, there's no fuss ever about these things. And there below you can see a copy, which is now today in the Wallenstein Gardens. So the copy is in Prague, where it originally stood, the original one stood. And to alter the emphasis, really, we've looked at some artists. We've looked at De Vries, and now the collection of cut stones, carved and cut stones in Rudolf's collection was supreme. I mean, the best that the world could ever possibly have imagined. This is a fragment of what survived, and there are many more still surviving, fortunately, in Vienna. There's a jasper jug. Bearing in mind that this is cut from just a solid chunk of stone. There's a jug with mounts by a Dutch artist called Paulus de Vries. There's a agate cameo, mounts by a Flemish jeweler called Vermeyen. A heliotrope vase, again with mounts by Vermeyen. An agate bowl by Vermeyen. Carved, and then the jewels by Vermeyen, the mounting, and their jasper bowl. I mean, all these exquisite objects, absolutely exquisite. None of them are very big. The jug's about sort of 6 inches high, 9 inches high. And these are created by a man called Ottavio Miseroni. Miseroni, obviously from Italy, again summoned to Prague, and he was one of, not the only one, but there were many others, but he was one of the great stone cutters at the time, working in Prague. You can see his son here. This is a portrait. Obviously, the father was making his way in life and creating these beautiful objects I've just shown you. There, the son obviously looks frightfully grand and very sort of overfed. And there is Dionysius Miseroni, painted by a Czech artist called Skreta. It's in the National Gallery of Prague. There is the Dionysius Miseroni with his wife and his family, his children. And I'll show you some details. There's the eldest son, Ferdinand Eusebio, who in fact becomes the 3rd generation of stone cutters, and then the family dies out. But there he is handling, as a young lad, finding a huge rock crystal, a cut rock crystal vase. Below is the mother pointing the little child's attention towards a huge cut emerald. there are two of the boys just playing with a bit of quartz. And most interesting itself, in the background of the painting, are these huge wheels, which are the wheels, there are 4 of them, the wheels that are cutting the stone. And imagine these huge wheels cutting these tiny objects in a detailed and elaborate form, which is almost impossible even to achieve now with modern technology. It is quite unbelievable. And they were geniuses. The family dies out as stonecutters with the 3rd generation of Ferdinand Eusebio, but the tradition continues because now the Bizzarroni and other Italian stonecutters have shown the Czech people and the artisans of Prague what can be done with these big wheels, how you can cut things. And that's when they moved from cutting stone in the 18th century to cutting glass. And that's why Czech cut glass is so significant and is so still very collectible today. Now, Vermeyen is the jeweler at court, and he creates the crown of Rudolf. This is the crown that Rudolf has created for him by the jeweler Vermeyen. Jan Vermeyen came from Brussels and obviously spends his life and dies in Prague. And the crown becomes then eventually in the 19th century the imperial crown of Austria, and it is survives from 1602. There's one sapphire, but it's quite a big sapphire up there. And interestingly, it is shaped, very symbolic this, it's a crown for a ruler, a king, but it also is shaped in the shape of a mitre. So it's got, in other words, the king rules the people and is head of the church. It's that sort of emphasis. And the 4 sections of the mitre have 4 gold low relief illustrations of Rudolf. And there's Rudolf being crowned the great victor. And Rudolf was never a victor. I mean, Rudolf was never victorious at anything. But nevertheless, this is a lovely fantasy. He's being crowned as the conqueror of the Turks. And it's interesting, though, who was the enemy then? And who is the enemy now? It's about the same thing, really. Anyway, there we go. And on the other side, he's then being crowned the king, the king of Bohemia. And look at the enamel work, the pearls, absolutely exquisite. He was an absolute genius, Vermeyen. And this is his greatest work, of course. Now today in Vienna, it's in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Now, there is a story that all those craftsmen lived in this pretty little street behind St. Vitus Cathedral. It's called the Golden Lane, and that's why it's called golden, because they thought that the craftsmen would be working at their gold objects and so on. Nowadays, I'm afraid, to dispel the image and the fantasy, it is thought to have been where the soldiers who were the guards of Rudolf lived. But nevertheless, it's terribly pretty. Today, it's filled with all these little buildings of sort of souvenir shops, and it's very, very crowded, but it still has a wonderful atmosphere. I didn't take this photograph. You couldn't possibly take a photograph without any people in Prague today. But it is called the Golden Lane, and it is entrancingly characteristic and atmospheric. Now, Rudolf, as I say, was not only one of the great art patrons of the world, but if not the greatest, but he was also a supporter of science as it was emerging. Science was a new idea then, and he appoints as his court what is called the imperial mathematician, but he was the court astronomer, a man called Tycho Brahe. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it in Danish, but I apologize if anyone speaks Danish. And anyway, he's very famous, Brahe, and he works for Rudolf, and in fact, working for Rudolf, he records the exact position of 777 stars. Well, I mean, that's amazing at the time, again, without any of the great modern influence we have, and his tomb, he's buried in Prague in the Tin Church. Now, he is succeeded as the astronomer to Rudolf by a German, because Brahe is Danish, as I say. He's succeeded by Kepler, who of course is German. And in fact, he will publish what is called his Rudolphine tables in honor of Rudolf, in honor of the patronage that he's received from Rudolf. And of course, he'll also discover the movement of the planets as they move around the sun. I mean, it's all very advanced, and this is all patronized by Rudolf, who was obviously fascinated by the new world that was emerging around about him. But he also veered to the extreme, and he dabbled in sort of mysterious things of the astrology, and so he was duped by this chap on the third guy, John Dee, who comes from England, and he was an astrologer and an astronomer, but he was a very dubious sort of character, and he apparently claimed he could speak to angels. So it was all a bit shady. So you've got the extremes, that Rudolf is certainly patronizing some of the great figures in astronomy at the time, but also he's being duped by alchemists who say they can produce gold out of base metal and all that sort of nonsense, which Rudolf is also fascinated by. But then he was this very, very complex, very strange man. Now, as I say, he's deposed. There he is, looking again very benign in one of these portraits. This again by a German, Hans von Aachen. And Rudolf progressively is stripped of his power until he abdicates within the year that he dies. He's succeeded by his brother Matthias. Matthias, who's not a bad chap, and he does, though, move his capital back to Vienna, almost as a reaction against Rudolf. And in doing that, he takes the treasures that now remain in Vienna, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, which is one of the great museums of the world, and partly, almost not substantially, because of Rudolf. The Bruegels, the Dürers, and so on, which survive. And also those treasures I've shown you. Those amazing carved stone objects are all in Vienna. And so, fortunately, Matthias takes them back to Vienna. He leaves, however, a substantial amount still in Prague, the sort of dross, as it were, because he still needs an enormous amount of paintings, an enormous amount of treasure there, which, of course, has largely now been dispersed. Now, another figure at the time is that when Matthias moves his capital, when he becomes emperor in 1611, when he moves his capital back, the Protestants, the Hussites in Prague and in the Czech lands, still feel confident enough to approach a man called Frederick V, who's the Elector Palatine. The Palatine estate, the state of the Palatine is the Rhine. It's the area of the Rhine. And the Elector Palatine, Frederick V at the time, was Protestant. And the Bohemian Protestant estates approach him to become their king. In other words, they are declaring UDI. They're declaring independence from Austria. And it was a rather extreme move. At the time, you see, the Czechs felt oppressed by the dominance of Vienna. And they still did through the centuries. And so when the representatives from Vienna came to the Vladislav Hall that I showed you earlier, that hall with an elaborate Gothic vaulting, adjacent to the Vladislav Hall are a series of smaller rooms where the council met and where the dignitaries were sort of having their meetings and so on. And from one of those rooms, they threw the two representatives from Vienna. They threw them forcibly out of the window. And they were called Slavata and Martinich. Slavata and Martinich, with these two men, together with their secretary, were all three of them thrown out of the window as obviously a positive reaction to the feelings of the Czechs, who felt themselves belittled by Vienna and their dominance of them. And so this was intended to throw them to their death. It's a three-story building. They throw quite a height. And somehow they survived. We never know why. The Catholic Church says because angels picked them up. And the Protestants say that they landed on a dung heap, so you can take one or the other. Anyway, they survived. And so then, of course, their survival means, well, whether they lived or died, but they survive, they run, they go back, they escape, and then this is the spark. in May 1618, the date 1618, that the 30 Years' War is ignited. It doesn't start at that moment, but the 30 Years' War will rumble along and then suddenly explode in a couple of years' time. This is the year during which Frederick V is the Elector Palatine, is the King of Prague. He rules for 1 year with his English wife. And then in November 1620, it's a very dramatic time, you see. I mean, there's the Czechs have tried to declare their independence. They've elected their own king. They throw out the officials out of the window, and then all hell breaks loose. And they lose a decisive battle. And so the headline, which is the caption at the top, which is not exactly, I didn't make it up, I saw it on the internet, "A Black Day at the White Mountain." And it's a black day for the Czechs. A black day, and the White Mountain is the Bela Hora. It's just outside Prague. You can go there on a tram now. And it is a ridge. And you can go there, and today there's memorials and so on. And it is where this decisive victory of the Catholics took place over the Protestants. The defeat of the Protestants was absolutely vast, and the forces of the Catholics succeeded. In doing so, 27 of the Protestant leaders were dragged back to Prague and were executed. And there today, adjacent to the astronomical clock, are the 27 crosses of recording the 27 men of the Protestant army that were persecuted. And from that victory, then as I say, the 30 Years' War covers the whole of Germany, covers all the Central Europe, and will continue until 1648. And there is a man called Jacques Callot, who was originally French, and there he's showing one of his famous illustrations of the horrors of war. The horrors of war, and there's people strung up and so on. Terrible, terrible injustices were done by both sides. And the war raged backwards and forwards. Villages were destroyed time after time. The Swedes get involved on the Protestant side. And the 30 Years' War lasts until 1648, when finally Prague is stormed by the Swedish forces on the Protestant side in 1648. The ruler of Sweden then was Queen Christina, like Rudolf, a very peculiar person, and she learned of the capture of Prague on the 5th of August 1648, immediately writes to her general, Christoph von Königsmarck, instructing her to seize for her important paintings and other artifacts from Rudolf's library and his Kunstkammer. Königsmarck dispatches 40,000 objects, including 700 paintings, as well as the priceless library of Rudolf. And nevertheless, Queen Christina was disappointed because she wanted more Italian paintings. So that's when the de Vrieses and when the Archimboldo paintings and all the rest go to Sweden. And there is an example there of a very typical Mannerist painting of a Venus, this slithery, long, elongated pose, which is in the National Museum of Stockholm today, and that was one of the paintings which went to Sweden. But that wasn't the end of it, of course, because there was looting personified, and so therefore there were many other peoples grabbing this bit of gold and grabbing that painting and so on, which have all just now been dispersed. I mean, war is like that. War creates this terrible, terrible chaos. And so, but that is why today, as I say, you can see the Archimboldos and so on, and the de Vrieses in Sweden because of Queen Christina's avarice nature. So finally, quickly, to end with Sir John Nepomuk. He's a figure of the 14th century. We're going back in time. Born in a town called Pomuk, and then it's now been made into Nepomuk, St. John Nepomuk. And he studies at Prague University. He becomes the Archbishop of Prague. This is the Catholic Archbishop. And then he's tortured and thrown into the river Vltava to his death. At the behest of Wenceslas IV. Wenceslas IV, son of Charles IV, we saw yesterday. The reason given for the PR purposes was that he was supposedly refused to reveal the secrets of his wife's confession, the Queen's confession. But that isn't true. The reason was that St. John Nepomuk was opposing the king's attempts to dabble in the ecclesiastical affairs. And he's buried at St. Vitus Cathedral, and that sort of is the end of the story, except then, following the Battle of the White Mountain, following the resurgence of the rise of Catholicism in the Habsburg Empire, you have the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation needed figures for the general public to latch onto. They established these figures who they canonized and then made into saints, that they were figures not going way back into early Christian history. They were figures of events and people that the actual public could relate to. There was St. Teresa of Avila, for instance, the Spanish mystic, St. John Nepomuk, and suddenly these figures are snatched from obscurity almost, or relative obscurity, to become incredibly important figures in the Catholic Church. And so this is St. John Nepomuk. You see, they erect a bronze statue to him on the bridge. This is the very first statue erected. On the Charles Bridge. It's by Brockhoff, one of the two great sculptors. He's beatified and canonized. It's all going on hundreds of years after he met his death being thrown into the river. But he's now becoming a hugely important saint, and still today, right across southern Germany, you'll find, and in Austria, you'll find churches dedicated to St. John Nepomuk. It's all part of this resurgence and this rise of Catholicism taking place in the late early 1700s. And he's used for that purpose. That's a painting of him being thrown from the bridge. That is a historic event. And there's the position on the bridge with the cross there on the bridge balustrade, showing the position where he's thrown into the bridge. So it was a nasty death and a horrid, horrid thing to do, but he would have remained a fairly obscure person except for the desire to create this series of modern saints in the church in the late 1600s. And there is today in the Cathedral of St. Vitus, and it's really unbelievably extraordinary, fantastic, is the tomb of St. John Nepomuk. I mean, this is all again 18th century, hundreds of years after he died. Nobody thought of giving him a tomb before. And that's all created out of solid silver, this enormous structure here. This is the Baroque at its most exaggerated and its most elaborate. There he is above, and he always is shown with a halo with 5 stars on them, so that's what he's wearing about on his head. And there you see it again. Solid, solid silver. Silver from the mines of the Czech lands, because, as I said, it was always a very significant monetary aspect of the Czech lands. They were wealthy because of the minerals in the ground. And what is rather charming, because this elaborate, totally exaggerated statue, tomb rather, but can you see the angels? I love them. They're sort of suspended in the air. They obviously have some hook somewhere to attach to themselves to, but they're holding up the curtains, flying in the sky. A wonderful bit of Baroque, that. But what's utterly wonderful and charming is that you can see there's a balcony. It's part of the royal box in St. Vitus. And below, facing the silver tomb, is a miner. And it's a miner, obviously, who's in adoration, but he's presenting his lamp. But he's also, as he were, getting a look in. He's sort of part of this scene, because without his efforts and without the dangerous work, the silver would have never come out of the ground. And there, this is contemporary with the tomb itself, the statue of the silver miner from Kutna. Now we're getting into the Baroque period, and I thought I'd end, and if any of you want to leave, it'll take about 4 or 5 minutes. I think I'll end with a symphony by a man called Franz Bender, because, again, this is a reminder of the subservience of the Czechs, that all the great musicians in the 16th and 1700s, 17th and 18th centuries had to leave Prague because there was no court, there was no patronage. They either had to go to Vienna, which was sort of second best really, or they would try their luck in the court of Dresden or the court of Berlin. And in fact, Bender, and he was one of a vast range of family who produced music. Franz Bender worked at the court of Frederick the Great in Berlin and in Potsdam, where he dies. So it's rather jolly. I'll only play the first movement.